Hey everybody, this is Pastor Chris. I'm coming to you live from Lexington Park Baptist Church. This is PC Studios, and it is April the 3rd, 2024. How in the world are you doing today? I hope you're blessed, highly favored by God. We've got some bad weather. Just praying for the people of Ohio and Kentucky. A lot of storms went through. A lot of friends and family members that I know were actually impacted by this storm, and everybody's okay that I'm aware of. Thank God, but I know some were not that fortunate. A lot of things were destroyed. And just shows you when nature is all out of whack, right? When everything's tainted by sin, bad things happen. And so when we see these disasters, I hate that people call them, connect them with God. God's not the one that calls these things. It's actually the fact that all of creation is fallen and sinful, and hurricanes and tornadoes and storms and things. The earth is not perfect anymore, nor are we, just like our sin. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, the need of the resurrection, because the resurrection leads to restoration. The resurrection is about really is the redemption. The earth groans for the redemption of humanity, of the sons and daughters of Christ, and if you will, the sons and daughters of Adam, right? The second Adam in Christ. So let's look at this resurrection as we are following in the aftermath of Easter. And let's look at it a little bit deeper today. What will that be like? What's the resurrection? What's the big deal? Why is it so important? Well, it's everything. Like I just led to real life scenarios, right? The resurrection will bring the redemption, not just spiritually of us, but will really bring the restoration of everything that's even physical. So this Gnostic thought that I started talking about, Gnosticism was disproven. Jesus did come in the flesh. It wasn't just spiritual. And his bodily resurrection was immaterial. It was a resurrected, glorified body that had no sin, had nothing wrong, though Jesus got that body first. He's the first fruit of the resurrection. So shall we follow him. Our spirits may go to be with the Lord when we're separated from this body, but somehow the glorified body is what God will usher into all of eternity. So keep that in mind, a bodily resurrection. So gets in 1 Corinthians 15, 35 through 36. And I encourage you, the whole chapter 15, Paul is making a persuasive appeal, an argument to people who might doubt the resurrection, the entire chapter. And so he says this, but someone will ask, how are the dead raised? And what kind of body will they have when they come? So those two questions, how are the dead raised? And then what kind of body are we going to have? I'm planning on talking a little bit about those things. And he says, you fool, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. So Paul's building this analogy off of really a fact that we would know in life. Now, most of us today are not farmers, and we don't think this way, but something must die to produce life. And he's saying it's the same for us. So for here, he's given this answer. How's the answer? What will this resurrection of the dead? How will the dead be raised? Just like a seed goes into the ground and dies, and it comes out, right? So he goes on in verses 37, 38. And as for what you sow, you are not sowing the body that will be, but only a seed, perhaps of wheat or another grain. But God gives it a body as he wants, and to each of the seeds its own body. So he's telling us that just like seeds die, right? It's going to happen. Now, Jesus said this in the Gospel of John chapter 12, 24. I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains by itself. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. What dies lives. We don't think that way because we look at death as permanent, because we think of it humanly, or we think of it practically from the different types of flesh. And that's what he goes on in verses 39 through 42. He tells us, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that tomorrow, but he talks about there's different types of flesh. We are so related to the flesh. We are so related. This is where Gnostics, that's why they didn't like the material. But we know that we're created good and very good. All the fish, all the birds, all the different types of flesh, and then finally our flesh. We know that sin has tainted those things. But and in that regard, they're bad. And that's why we need a glorified body. But what God is saying, what dies must live. So for us, we view life because we lose each other. We love each other. We get attached to an animal, or we see the destruction of creation and it devastates us, right? We're thinking that's almost, we treat it like it's permanent. And I understand we have the loss in this moment. We grieve in that moment. So I'm not belittling death, but we must realize that death is really a portal for us as believers to eternity. And death, the death of our physical body, because we're spiritually, listen, everyone will be resurrected. Not a single human being that exists will cease to exist. Now you may say, how do you have evidence of that? Well, the Bible, this is our belief system. This is what Jesus taught. The conquering the grave is about the bodily resurrection, but truly this going to heaven, being with God, being absent from this body, to be in the presence of the Lord, our spirit will go on, the essence of who we are, will go on into what we know heaven, but a new heaven, a new earth, and a new Jerusalem, which will have a physical existence, like a tangible material thing, with our glorified bodies, will be where we will usher in and live forever. It's huge. It's bigger than ourselves. It's hard to comprehend. But think of this created order. God has created a new glorified place from what we got wrong, that we will usher into existence forever with him. And this temporal existence that we have now is temporary. It must die to produce that new life. We must die so that we can be glorified someday. And that's what God's going to produce in us. Again, the reason it's complicated is it sounds sci-fi for you and me. We're thinking, how can this be? They're asking the question of Paul back then. You might ask the question today. And Jesus is saying, look at the evidence of, when you plant something, it dies and it bears the fruit. Paul's saying the same thing. You must die to put on this glorified body that's coming. And he talks about in verses 39 to 42, let's go ahead and this flesh is the same flesh, but there's not all flesh is the same. So one flesh is for humans, another flesh is for animals, another is for birds, and another is for fish. There are heavenly bodies and there are earthly bodies. This is what I want you to understand. We will have heavenly bodies versus our earthly bodies. Our earthly bodies are tainted by sin. They corrupt. They're going to die. They're going to decay. They're going to break down. They're not meant. Our bodies right now are not meant to live forever. Now, here's the good news. There's the splendor of different things, and there will be a splendor of this glorified body for us. There's the splendor of the sun, another of the moon, another of the stars. The stars differ from one another in splendor. So it will be in the resurrection of the dead. Sown in corruption, but raised in incorruption. And it's not really the same thing as recycling, but God kind of is like into recycling. Our bodies will be recycled or rebirthed or renewed or restored or totally recreated. And by the way, I'm going to be honest, there are some people that I believe it's totally recreated, but there are some people that believe it's just like a restoration of a car type of mentality. However God does it, my body's going to be raised up. Your body's going to be raised up. It's going to be glorified. Our spirit will be reunited, and we will live forever with God. So the earthly body that we know will cease to exist. But the heavenly body, the forever body, the glorified body will go on forever. What is now corruptible, though, will become incorruptible. So sown in corruption when we die, but raised in incorruption when we're raised. And this is what Paul's teaching. It is a philosophy. It is deep theology. It is something we cannot prove. Like there's many things people can't prove. You actually can't prove creationism versus evolutionism. People make all kinds. You weren't there. We're not here for this. When we die, that's the experiment for you and me. When we die as the corrupted flesh, then we'll see our spirit move on, and then someday we'll see this incorrupted flesh that's raised. Until that day, we only have the evidence of Jesus, to be honest with you. And so Jesus is our evidence. Jesus is the evidence of the resurrection, and that's Paul's argument. You see Jesus raised, you'll be raised. You can't say you believe Jesus, but you're not going to be raised. We already talked, then our faith is in vain. What we say is this: Jesus is raised, and because he is raised, we will be raised. Because when we are sown in corruption, we will be raised in incorruption. This is the essence of the resurrection. This is the essence of the Christian faith. This theology of corruption to incorruption, from our mortal, decaying bodies to this glorified body, is the evidence that we see in Jesus. And it's the hope where the end of this chapter says, death, where's your sting? You know, there should not be sting in death if we understand this eternal perspective of God. We grieve the loss of someone, but the sting of death, and it does sting, it does hurt, but it can't be eternal. We have to see a bigger picture. And I'm not saying you can't cry. I'm not saying you can't be sad. None of those things. So don't get me wrong, but I think we just need to see death differently. Now, we grieve with hope. First, in Thessalonians, it says, we as Christians, we grieve with hope because we know the resurrection, right? We know this. Those that are without it grieve with a grieving of loss that can never be replaced. And so what I would say is, if we grieve in death, it should be grieving for someone who died without Christ, or a family that doesn't know Christ. That's hopeless. But for us, you and me, and I'm hoping any of my audience that knows Jesus, we would grieve with hope because we have Christ, because Christ is raised. And because Christ is raised, we know we have life beyond the grave. What was sown in corruption will be raised in incorruption. So this body that we see, that we get so close to, just know that it will die. Every one of us has that destination. But when it's like a seed put into the ground, God will produce this incorruptible, glorified body someday. Our spirits go on to be with the Lord. The absence from this body is to be with the Lord. This is what Paul teaches. This is the teachings of Jesus. This is the hope that we have in the resurrection. And I hope that gives you encouragement as you face someday your own mortality, as I do as well, and as we lose loved ones, or as we go to funerals, or as we minister to people that are dealing with the grief of someone who's died. And also that it would motivate us to share this gospel, because outside of Christ, there is no hope. The resurrection of the condemnation is for those outside of Christ. The resurrection to life is what we have with the hope of Jesus Christ. Hey, let's live in that moment, ponder that, marinate that in your life today, and just think of the hope that you have, and be grateful if you know Jesus, that you know that death is just the portal to life. God bless you. Have a great day. Remember these two realities. God loves you. So do I. I'll see you here tomorrow. Take care.